I think that that process of engaging with difficult conversations can be hard. And I think that we put up walls to protect ourselves from that. We decide to just go watch Netflix, or we decide to sort of tune out of the news. And to a certain extent, that is intended to protect us. When we insulate ourselves in that fashion, we also insulate ourselves from the very best potential of what it means to be human. And we insulate ourselves from those really deep and profound human connections that I think can sustain us and can help us grow.
Well, hey everyone. Welcome to episode 436 of F-Stop, Collaborate, and Listen. I'm your host, Matt Payne, and today's episode is a powerful one. I'm joined by John Noltner, a photographer and storyteller who made the bold decision, alongside his wife, to sell their home in 2020 and spend the next 2.5 years living on the road. Over 900 days and 93,000 miles, John collected hundreds of stories across the country, all part of his ongoing project, A Piece of My Mind. In this conversation, we explore the heart of that journey, how it shaped his relationship to listening, connection, and trust. We talk about his new book, Lessons on the Road to Peace, and how it navigates some of the most difficult conversations in America with a tone of compassion, hope, and curiosity. We also dive into how his practice of environmental portraiture becomes a bridge to empathy, and how photographers and creatives can use storytelling as a tool to heal, connect, and inspire action. Whether you're into documentary work, personal storytelling, or simply trying to make sense of the world through a lens, this episode is going to speak to you in meaningful ways. Okay, here's my conversation with John Noltner. All right. John Noltner, it's great to have you on the podcast.
Hey, man, thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. I'm really interested in this conversation, and you just seem like one of the types of people that I know that if we met and had a beer, we would get along. So I think this is going to be super fun.
Yeah, no doubt. No doubt. Looking forward to it.
Awesome, man. Well, for people who aren't familiar with you and your photography and your project, tell us a little about who you are.
Yeah, sure. I'm based in Minnesota. We've been pretty nomadic for the last 5 years or so. We can talk more about that. But right now, Minnesota is home. I have spent my career as a freelance photographer shooting for national magazines and Fortune 500 companies. 15 years ago, I started this small personal project, a storytelling project called A Piece of My Mind, P-E-A-C-E, that kind of piece. You know, and I used to call myself strictly a photographer. Now I am also an author and a storyteller, and I tend to think curator of stories that can heal and help connect people. I'm a father, got 2 kids who are grown and doing their own thing. I have a dog. I don't have a house. We used to have a house and sold it. And like I said, we're still semi-nomadic, but we're working towards solving that. And really, I spend my time now leading programming across the country with the stories in this project and the portraits in this project. We've got 5 traveling exhibits and 4 books, and we use these stories to help people have really challenging conversations about conflict resolution and civic responsibility and social change. So in the last year, we've done that on a couple of continents and in probably 30 states. And the international stuff is about to ramp up. So that's,
Wow.
and this is sort of a non sequitur. I'm also a Christmas tree farmer. That's the other part of my life.
Man, that's random.
It's a little random, but you know, a lot of what I do involves travel. A lot of what I do involves moving around to new places. About 15 years ago, my wife and I wanted someplace where we could also feel rooted. Well, maybe
No pun intended.
Maybe pun intended, but a place that we could get to know well in all of the seasons and return to. And while a lot of my work is sort of program based and temporary, this is my long-term 3-dimensional art project that I work at the art.
Got it. Okay. Well, something you just said really resonated with me in terms of the project being about serving the purpose of telling stories, providing a mechanism for healing, giving people opportunities to engage in civil dialogue and be more responsible humans in this current ecosystem that we find ourselves in. And man, I I can't tell you how exciting that sounds to me, given the way I'm feeling right now in terms of like, you go to any social media network right now and it's like, these people are awful, those people are awful. There's all this name calling and all this fighting that's happening. And I'm like sitting on the sidelines going like, hold on a second. Like, I know those people, like they're actually pretty cool. They're not evil, like they're not really bad people. And I know these people that they think are bad aren't bad people too. So it's like, can we just have some conversations here? Tell us about your project and how it aims to bridge some of these divides that we find ourselves in right now.
Yeah, it's a great question, and clearly I haven't fixed it yet, but we're still working on it. Yeah, Matt, that all that stuff that you articulate is something that was going on in me 15 years ago. I was frustrated with the quality of our national dialogue. Like I couldn't even recognize the way people were describing certain demographics or people like me. Like I don't even recognize who you're talking about, and you think you're talking about me. And there's this really contentious civic debate, and that bothered me, that worried me, and I didn't think that there was a way for me to yell down those angry voices. Like I didn't think I could enter into the storm and yell just a little bit louder and be heard over all that noise. What I decided to do instead was to create an alternative, to just create a quiet and a little bit more contemplative space where we could see and hear one another better. And that started out really simple. I sat down with one person and I recorded an oral history, which I'd never done before. I had done a little bit of writing, but I did mostly photography for my whole career. But I wanted my photo vision to be paired with somebody else's words. Right? If I'm a middle-aged white guy with all the privilege and standing in the world, I didn't want my privilege to be the filter through which other people's stories were heard, many of whom don't share that same privilege. So I wanted to combine my photo vision with their words and their authentic story. And so I recorded this oral history. I did a portrait because I'm a photographer, and that was pretty interesting. So I did another one, and then I did another one. And the body of work just sort of grew. And really what I wanted to do was present an opportunity to hear other people's voices and to try to rediscover that common humanity that we all have. You know, if I'm sitting down with somebody who has been through the Holocaust, I certainly don't have any sort of personal experience that can give me any sort of bearing on that, what it's like to go through that experience. But there have been times where I've been worried. There have been times where I have felt excluded. There have been times when I felt marginalized in my life. And I hope, not that I'm ever going to have that same experience, but I hope through some sort of human empathy and compassion, I can start to make a little connection and I can start to open a space where I can hear that human vulnerability and that'll come through in the story. And so, you know, the project just kept growing, and the goal is simply to pause and to be able to hear each other a little bit better. And like I say, we haven't fixed it yet, but we keep finding new ways and new places to sort of respond to people's appetites for these sort of connections.
Yeah, that's really, really cool. It's funny, as you were talking, I've found myself kind of filling this role of being a little bit more nuanced and trying to be kind of like a filter for some of the people that are in my life that might not share the same views as each other. Like, I'm a nature photographer, so, you know, like 80 to 90% of the people that I know in the nature photography space are pretty like-minded in terms of typically being left-leaning politically. You know, they have a very strong connection with environmental causes, things of that nature. But I do have other friends of mine that don't necessarily share the same political beliefs, and they're really awesome people too. And so I'm always trying to like bridge those gaps between people and like, hey, hold on, like you need to know this person's story, and like you can't just discount them because you want to put them into this bucket. And then likewise for them, it's like you can't just discount all these other people over here because they fit some kind of narrative that, you know, serves some kind of weird tribalistic purpose for you. So what does that look like for your project in terms of providing those contextual stories and then giving people the ability to kind of slow down and sit with the content and maybe hopefully reform some of the way that they see others?
Yeah, that's a great question, Matt. It seems to me that 90% of the time I'm not a math guy. We're just using a number. But 90% of the time, it feels like those misunderstandings and those disconnections are because we're not in proximity to this group of people or that experience or that mindset. And if we can find a way to be in proximity, if we can find a way to be close to it, we start to understand it in some new ways. If we start to know somebody's name and their story, it becomes a little harder to marginalize. It becomes a little harder to hate. And so, if I'm going down to the border to we very intentionally walk into some really difficult and contentious issues. We'll go down to the border to talk immigration. We'll go down to Mississippi to talk about moving Confederate monuments. But by being in proximity and by talking and hearing from people who are directly impacted by these issues, you start to understand them in a way that I think you can't when you listen to sound bites and read headlines. So, and when you start to understand the human impact of some of these issues, boy, life gets more complex in a hurry. And,
Right.
and I like to get into those complex places and those complex moments and really wrestle with some of the tension and wrestle with some of the things. 90% of the time, again, math, and I'm not a math guy, but very often I find my own expectations challenged when I get into these interviews. And my hope is then in our exhibits and our podcasts and our books and our storytelling, not everybody has the luxury to be able to travel as much as I do, or maybe as much as you do, and experience these different places and cultures and mindsets. And so I hope that I'm able to share them through our content in a way that help people to see the world in a different way. As a nature photographer, you're photographing in the mountains. There are those beautiful scenes behind you there. I'm sure you travel not too far away and you photograph in in the red rock and in the desert, and you're photographing some of the little details that really make stuff beautiful, and you're photographing these grand vistas that make things beautiful. And none of those things is the only answer, right? None of those things is the full story, but you start putting them together and it's this really beautiful mosaic and this really beautiful body of work. And you're doing that with landscapes, and I'm trying to do that with some human stories. As a photographer, I'm convinced that there is beauty and wisdom all around us if we take the time to see it. I don't care if it's a rainy day or a sunny day, there is something beautiful to extract and notice in that moment. And the same is true with people. Whether they come from here or there, or their experience has been through the prison system or on a stage performing, there's beauty and wisdom there. And my practice and my exercise is to try to find that and to try to capture it in some way.
I love that. So you mentioned earlier that you started out kind of doing more kind of photojournalism and work for magazines and things of that nature. How has the monetization of like staying afloat, doing this sort of more kind of personal project type stuff, how does that look, and how are you able to make that work now?
Yeah, we had to go broke a few times while we figured it out, but that's I'm stubborn, so we kept going. Here's the arc, sort of the career arc. I graduated with a degree in journalism from the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. My degree was in writing, but my first job was a staff photographer at a daily paper. Did that for a couple of years. I moved over to Minneapolis and I worked in the commercial world, photographing a lot of boxes of crayons on white backgrounds and horrible things like that, which paid the bills but didn't really feed my soul. I learned a lot about technical skills, lighting, production value, that sort of thing. And then when I went out on my own again, started freelancing for magazines. Sort of the combination of human storytelling and high production value that I learned in the commercial world fit pretty well into the magazine world. So I did that for a long time, a few decades. Then in the recession in 2008, 2009, I like to say the economy handed me some free time. My workload dropped quickly and dramatically. I was going 100 miles an hour and I was not inclined to turn away good paying work. These were fun assignments. I'd photograph in a spa in Chicago. I'd photograph in a rainforest in Costa Rica. I'd photograph hot air ballooning over Sedona. It was fun stuff. I'm not going to say no to that when they paid me well. But when that free time opened up, when my workload slowed down, I had started feeling like I was getting tired of photographing someone else's vision, right? The assignments were always, hey, we want to do a story on this. Can you photograph it? Sure, great. But eventually I started figuring out I had something for myself to say. And so when that free time opened up, I should have probably done something to make money, but I instead started feeding my soul a little bit. And I started working on this project. It took me a good 7 or 8 years before I figured out a business model for it where I realized that there could be leasing fees for the exhibits. There could be book sales involved. There could be some programming fees if I was coming to a college to present. And so really we're now a 501c3. And so our pillars of revenue that help keep us afloat are exhibit leasing fees, programming fees for workshops and lectures, book sales, and we have a donor stream that supports our work. So a lot of the storytelling that I do, I just went out to Willamette University and we did work with students for an organization called the Conversation Project. And we helped them understand how storytelling can bridge divides and build community. There's revenue stream attached to that lets us keep doing the work. But also, I live in Minneapolis, and when George Floyd was killed, I knew that there would be some powerful stories to tell around that intersection of 38th and Chicago. And so I brought a portable studio there, and we gathered local stories and just asked people in the community, what do you want to say? There's no revenue attached to that. I'm telling those stories because I think they're important to tell. And those are the sort of things that our donor base can help support, that agree that this kind of storytelling is important in the world. Next month, I'm going to Northern Ireland to gather stories about how people have navigated some of their sectarian violence in history and how they found ways to move towards healing in that community. There's no revenue attached to that, but our donor base can support that because they're important stories to hear and important stories to tell, and hopefully we can learn some lessons that are useful in our context.
I love that. Yeah. One thing important to know about me is prior to being a full-time photographer, I've worked in the nonprofit sector pretty much my entire career in human services areas. I was always kind of tangential to the fundraising side of things because I was always in program management. One of the things that always stuck with me is that you always have to have a way of demonstrating value to your funders in terms of like, here's our mission, here's what we hope to accomplish with what we're doing, with the work that we're doing, and here's how we're measuring that impact. And I'm curious, I'm sure you've thought about this, but I'm curious for what the work that you're doing, how are you measuring the impact that you're trying to have on the world through the project?
No, you found my weak point, Matt. I'm also from the program world, and I continue to do the work because anecdotally and sort of intuitively we understand that it matters, that it is worth doing. So we'll very often put up an exhibit, and if there's a story with somebody who shared a story about domestic violence, times when people have come up to me and said, you know what, I really needed to see that. That's going to help me step away from this thing that I've been struggling with. Or they'll say, boy, it's really good to read this. Now I know that I'm not alone. Veterans dealing with trauma, these sorts of things. We see the impact that these stories make on people, and we have all sorts of anecdotal evidence like that. We also gather things that say 93% of people who encounter these stories believe that it'll open a space where they can hear an adversary's position more readily.
Well,
things like that.
I mean, those qualitative data points are in some ways more meaningful for funders. Like, hey, like here's actual people who are saying that the work that we're doing is having a positive impact on their life. So I think it's perfect the way you described that.
Those are the things that move me. And on the days when I question what it is I'm doing and wonder why it is I'm doing it, those are the moments that keep me going.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I mean, the same thing with my podcast. Sometimes you go weeks without hearing from any listeners and things like that. And then out of the blue, someone will email you and say, that episode with John Noltner was amazing, and thank you so much.
That just changed my life.
Yeah, those kind of hearing that kind of feedback from people is so touching and so rewarding. I'm right there with you.
Hey, let me ask you a question, Matt. You said you used to work in the nonprofit sector. What was it that allowed you to shift from the kind of work that gives you a paycheck to the kind of work that doesn't?
Yeah, it's a good question. I got super lucky in that a friend of mine who works for the same company I now work for, Munch Workshops, his name is Wayne Suggs. We went photographing together at White Sands National Park, and he just kind of out of the blue asked me if I was ever interested in teaching for Munch Workshops. And I was like, yeah, that sounds awesome, man. And so if it wasn't for my ability to work with Munch Workshops, I probably would still need to have a full-time job in some other capacity, but they keep me super busy, and we have like a really great program and some of the best pro photographers in the industry, and we go to some of the most amazing places. So working for this company doing photography workshops has definitely helped a lot.
Nice.
Yeah. And so some might argue like, oh, you still have a full-time job then. And it's like, yeah, that's fair. But I'm doing photography.
Right. It's not like you're working in a bank crunching numbers and then going out and taking pictures on the weekends.
Right,
And I
exactly.
think anything, I mean, when you are a working artist, anything that you can do to exercise those muscles and to
Yes.
practice your vision and to sort of implement your view of how the world works is good work. I mean, I'm the administrator of a small nonprofit, so yeah, I do a lot of photography and I do a lot of storytelling, but I also have to figure out the marketing and I also have to figure out the budget and all of those other things. People see those gorgeous images on your wall there and they think, oh wow, it's all sunrises and stunning scenery, but of course, that is a small percentage of what makes the whole machine work.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, it's awesome because we're like 20 minutes in and I haven't even asked you any questions yet that I have on my list, which
That's
is actually
the way the best conversations unfold, right?
yeah, it's perfect. So I do want to ask you though, I guess in 2020, you kind of made the bold decision with you and your wife to sell your house and hit the road for over 2 years. What motivated you into that kind of more nomadic style of living, and what were you hoping to accomplish with your time?
There's a lot of ways to answer that. One of the ways is that I had always wanted to have a more nomadic way of living. This was an opportunity. It was another chance to go broke because all of I have a great and deep experience with learning how to be comfortable with financial risk. And it's not because I was born into $1 million. It's because there are other ways to measure our success in life. And so, finally I built up a piece of my mind to where it was rolling pretty good. And we had a great revenue stream based on these public engagements. And then March 17th and 18th, specifically in 2020, my entire full schedule for the year just wiped clean.
Right.
We went into lockdown. Everything went away. Everything was uncertain. So we lost our whole revenue stream. And I thought, oh my God, this thing I've been working on for 10 years is just going to go away. But my wife, Karen, who's a very smart person, she said, what if I quit my job and we sold the house and we went out on the road and you can still do interviews, right? You can't do your programming, but you can still do new interviews if you set up outside and put microphones 15 feet apart and we can travel probably as safely as we can just quarantine in our own basement. And it did not take me long to say yes. So we did. The fall of 2020, we sold our house. Also, when George Floyd was killed and I went to that intersection and we gathered stories, it was clear to me that there was something going on in our country. There was something, this cracked open a space where we could have some new sorts of conversations. And I wanted to dive deep and have some of those conversations. And so, yeah, we sold our house. We started out by buying a full-size truck and a 34-foot trailer. That felt like a pretty good downsize to go from 2,300 square feet to a 34-foot trailer. But a year into our journey, the trailer frame broke in California, luckily at 2 miles an hour as we pulled into a campsite. But that's when we retooled down into the van and got even more nimble. And that was a good choice. I loved that a lot. When we started the road trip, we didn't know how long we were going to stay out. We thought, well, we'll give it a year and we'll see how it feels. But 3 or 4 months in, we thought, oh God, a year's going to go really fast. Let's just not put a back end on this. Let's just go until we realize that it's time to be done. And for us, luckily that happened at the same time. And it was about 2.5 years into it. So 900 days, 93,000 miles across the country, and 50 interviews with people from all different backgrounds.
Yeah, that's incredible. I'm curious to hear your thoughts a little bit on the freedoms that the nomadic lifestyle afforded you in terms of like not being tied down to possessions, not being tied down to kind of the regular day of life in America. Like, like you get into these routines and you have stuff and you have bills to pay and like all these trappings that come with that sort of kind of normal lifestyle. Like, what did the nomadic lifestyle teach you about what you really value in life?
Yeah, well, it taught me that there are trappings no matter what you do. Like it looks amazing and easy and simple. I will tell you, getting rid of stuff was amazing. We sold and gave away most of our stuff. We kept mementos in storage, little refrigerator pictures that the kids had drawn and things like that. But we got rid of most of our furniture. We got rid of our little baby grand piano. We got rid of all of this stuff. And especially by the time, well, when the trailer broke, we had to pack up everything into a U-Haul and bring it back to Minnesota while we sorted out what was next. And we kept pulling stuff out of the trailer going, oh my God, we never used this, we never used that, we never used the other. All these things that you think you need in life, they just turn into weight. I mean, for me, I loved having 3 pairs of pants and a couple of t-shirts and 1 coffee mug. When it was time to clean the van, it took about 10 minutes. And so there were other logistics concerns, like, oh, where are we going to find a shower to take? Or I have this, especially as the pandemic loosened its grip and I started doing more programming from the road, I've got to upload these big files. We don't have Wi-Fi out here in this beautiful camping spot. We're going to have to drive into a coffee shop. So where am I going to do my laundry? Where are we going to park the van and sleep tonight? There were things like that, but they were the most basic sort of human needs. And like you say, being able to step away from the normal routines and ritual of life, we convinced ourselves that when we came back to modern Western living, that we would remember how simple things could be. But of course, some of that stuff just creeps up on you. So we're working intentionally to reel some of those in and get rid of some of those things again and be more intentional about life. Because sometimes if you don't resist the status quo comes and bites you in the butt.
It's so true. Yeah. 2023, I did the Colorado Trail, which took me 35 days. And I think I stayed in a hotel room like 3 times across that period of time. The rest of the time I was sleeping outside. Took like maybe 1 shower a week. Bathed in the rivers and lakes and, mailed myself all my food in advance. Going through that experience for me was super enlightening in terms of like what you really value in life. And a lot of the stuff, like you said, like that, really, do I need that stuff? And what do you really care about? It really puts a lot of that stuff into perspective. And I'm guessing that you had a very similar experience across the 2.5 years you were doing your nomadic journey. I'm curious, how did living fully on the road shape the way that you listened and engaged with other human beings on your project?
Yeah, I think I've always been bold about asking challenging questions and being willing to be a little uncomfortable and learn new things. But I think when we were on the road, it was all of that on steroids. And I think it taught me that it's okay to walk into places where you don't know all of the answers. It's okay to expose your vulnerabilities and ask for help, understanding the way things work. If I'm gonna be down in the Gulf of Mexico with indigenous communities who are dealing with food sovereignty issues, if I'm going to be working with folks who are unhoused on Skid Row, if I'm going to be working with vets who are trying to reduce trauma and trying to work on suicide prevention, these are all issues that I'm familiar with, but I'm certainly not an expert on. And so that willingness to be honest and be vulnerable and say, help me understand this. What am I not thinking of? What am I not seeing in this situation? And then being willing to listen to the answer, even when those answers might point out some of my own shortcomings. I think I've gotten pretty comfortable setting my ego aside and saying, okay, yeah, you're probably right. I've got some room to grow. I've got some room to learn. And, this happened to me early in the project. When I shared my first exhibit, I was doing a lecture about it, and a Ojibwe woman walked up to me afterwards and she said, how come I don't see any indigenous folks in your project? Do we not matter? At which point I could have said, hey, this is my art project. Don't tell me how to do it. Wrong answer. Or I could say, yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I can probably do better. And one step further, can you help me figure out how? Who can you connect me to? What story should I make sure to invite into the project, so that over time, if there's a mother with a kid with a disability who says that same thing to me, then I can invite someone with a physical disability into the project. If I have the chance to expand this lens and let people feel like they're being seen and heard and valued in this process, that makes the project better, even if it comes at the price of me having to admit that I had a certain set of blinders on and I needed to expand my view so that I could hear these other voices as well. It's the whole point of the project, and I've had a lot of learning to do in the process as well.
I love that. A lot of what you just said is like encapsulates values and ways of thinking and ways of being as a human being that I aspire to and try to, especially like the defensiveness stuff. Like, you know, like you said, you could have easily just shut her down and be like, hey, it's my project, get off my back. But like I found over and over again that if you kind of go against those tendencies that we have as humans and just try to be humble and vulnerable, like it can lead to so many rewarding things that are just going to make your life better and make whatever you're trying to work on better. I'm super curious if you could talk a little bit about how those core tenets of your approach to listening to others and the vulnerability aspect as you were sharing, how has that kind of translated in terms of your approach to the photography side of this project? Like I'm guessing that some of those skill sets and those mindsets have improved kind of the way that you approach the images.
Yeah, most definitely. And a lot of it is built around letting go, being willing to show up, being willing to sort of bear witness, and being willing to believe that something beautiful is about to unfold. You know, I've learned that with the interviews. I plan a lot of these things, right? If I'm going down to the border for 6 weeks, I'll make sure that I find an advocate or an ally at the border who's doing interesting work, who can connect me to people to interview. And I'll make sure that my first 2 weeks of time down there are filled up so I can be productive. But I also know and trust that when I'm there, other things will unfold and other things will present themselves. So everybody I interview, I'll say, well, who else do I need to meet? What else do I need to know? Who else should I be listening to so that I can understand this a little bit better? And at first, if I didn't have everything planned out, it would make me a little nervous. It would make, I want to be productive, but I've learned to trust that if I show up and I just start moving, that interesting things will happen. And sometimes that means, I've got to pay attention. I keep looking at that picture behind you. Is it sunrise or sunset?
Sunrise. From 14,000 feet after a crazy backpack.
Yeah, right. And you didn't know on the way up there that the light was going to work in your favor. You didn't know exactly what the composition was going to be, but you knew that you were going to set yourself up potentially for something lovely and something stunning. And then if you're paying attention, when all of those elements present themselves, then you can act on it. Right. And so I try to find, or I find that I do the same thing with storytelling and with my approach to this project, that I know the skills and I know the goal, and I'll try to sort of triangulate those and get them all moving in the same direction, which will then increase my odds of success, but then let go of a little bit of the outcome and believe that something beautiful is about to happen.
Yeah.
It doesn't always. Sometimes you get burned, and sometimes you might hike to the top of that 14,000 peak 5 times before everything comes together, but also that willingness to return. And if an interview doesn't quite go right, to say, you know what, can we try this again? I feel like there's more that I want to ask or more that I want to explore. Are you open to that? And not to hide behind this facade of professionalism, but to sort of embrace the humanism that lets me say, hey, I don't quite know what I want to do with this portrait, but I feel like we could do something really powerful. Let's talk about what's possible. What are you open to? What are your ideas? Here are some of my ideas. And together we can sort of create the space that improves our odds for being successful.
That's awesome. Yeah, as you were talking, I'm finishing up a book project that I've been working on for the last year that's based on my mountain climbing experiences and also hiking the Colorado Trail. And I have like these short quotes that kind of encapsulate every chapter. And one of my very first chapters on boldness. And the quote is, if you leap, the net will appear, which is exactly what you're describing in terms of like, you don't have to have everything planned out. You just need to like take the risk and like make sure you're in the right place at the right time. And then the next quote, I have another chapter that's all about preparation, and it's luck favors the prepared, right? So like it's both. It's an and. Like it's not all about preparing for everything, but you have to be open and willing to like just see what comes at you and be ready to capitalize on it. And those contradictory viewpoints, I think it's hard for some people to live in that space. But I think the more you can be flexible in that way, like the better outcomes you're going to have, not only in photography, but in life in general.
Yeah, I think so. And sometimes that means going against the odds. I mean, there was a time I drove I drove to Moab to do an interview of a guy who was a big wall climber, someone that did 1,000-foot walls. And I got in late afternoon, early evening, overcast and drizzly all day long, but I just wanted to drive through Arches a little bit to see what was going on. And I stopped at this one spot and I saw a tiny little crack at the horizon where the setting sun, maybe there was a 5% chance the setting sun was going to squeeze through there right before it went down and underlight all of those clouds in that stunning way. And I'm like, you know what? I'm going to just sit in my car drinking a Gatorade and eating a granola bar instead of going into dinner for a couple of hours. And then just before that sunset, I went out and I sat under a sheltered rock where I wasn't getting wet from the drizzle. And sure enough, it screamed through there at the end, and there was a double rainbow. It was the most stunning thing I'd ever seen. And for almost 2 hours straight, I thought, maybe I should just go. I'm really tired. I don't know. Is this worth it? But it's generally worth it.
100%. Yeah. You just described every landscape photographer, like the mindset that you have when you go to a location and you have this idea in mind, where you see the potential of a particular scene and you're looking around and like, oh, the clouds are looking like they could go off, and then you're like rolling the dice. But I mean, really, you just have to do it. And if it
just don't go home. Just keep.
Yeah. If it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. Either way, you still win.
It's a little bit of a sickness, really, but it's a good. It's a good sort of sickness.
Yeah, I totally agree. Well, I wanted to talk about your most recent book project. You've got a new book called Lessons on the Road to Peace, and it dives into some incredibly complex and emotional topics, from immigration to racial justice to homelessness. What has been your approach to engaging with those issues in a way that still allowed for human connection, especially in light of all of the negativity that we find ourselves in today's political atmosphere?
Yeah, that's a big question. Do we have 4 more hours to talk about that? It's, again, for me, it's about being in proximity to these issues. So again, I'm interested in all of these things. My dad was a social worker. My mom was an educator. In the storytelling I did for journalism, I would photograph people in the prison system. I would photograph people who had a terminal diagnosis for AIDS. I was encountering people who were navigating difficult terrains. And I found that oftentimes when people are figuring out how to navigate those terrains for themselves, that there's a hunger to share that with other people. Wow, I've learned this thing in this really difficult moment. I hope that I can share that with other people so that they can learn from it too. And so my methodology really became to find people who were engaged in these issues, either engaged in working towards solutions or directly impacted by these issues. That helps me understand the issues better than I can by reading a news article or watching a TV segment. And of course, not everybody is in a position where they want to share that. Nobody owes me an explanation. Nobody owes me an education. I'll do my research and learn as much as I can about those things. But then if I encounter somebody who is looking for an opportunity to share, who wants to help illuminate this issue for other people, well, those are my people. Those are the places that I go. But that has been my approach. And so your question was, how do you maintain the humanity in the midst of those really difficult issues? I think that's where the humanity is for me, in that honest engagement, in having conversations, in trying to illuminate these really complicated issues, in trying to believe that there are creative solutions to all of these things. And so when I watch the news, I get frustrated. But when I go out into the world and I talk to people face to face and one-on-one, that's where I find the connection. That's where I find the hope. And so from that standpoint, it's a little self-serving, but it becomes almost addictive to me to be able to have those difficult conversations, to be able to unwrap some of these really challenging issues, and to be able to find that human connection in the midst of it.
Yeah, I was hoping to ask you about that aspect of kind of like, these are heavy topics. These are like psychologically, I think when most people think about stuff like homelessness and, like domestic violence and suicide and all of these really, racial justice, immigration stuff, people are like, oh my God, I'm going to go watch something on Netflix. I can't do this. But then at the same time, you just talked about how like you have hope and it actually is value added for you. So how do you balance traveling through these emotionally loaded territories without feeling despair?
The answer is sometimes better than others. I mean, there is an element of self-care right? That
Yeah.
needs to happen. And for me, that happens through going hiking in beautiful landscapes. For me, that happens in listening to music and reading poetry, all of these things. There was a certain point on our 2.5 year journey that I realized that maybe my relationship with alcohol had become less productive and healthy than it once was. I think that maybe I was using that as a way to manage some of the challenges that I encountered in a world where we can't always control everything. That turned out to be a thing that I could control. So I stopped about 2.5 years ago because it wasn't serving me well anymore. But I think that process of engaging with difficult conversations can be hard. And I think that we put up walls to protect ourselves from that. We decide to just go watch Netflix, or we decide to sort of tune out of the news. And to a certain extent, that is intended to protect us. For me, when we insulate ourselves in that fashion, we also insulate ourselves from the very best potential of what it means to be human. And we insulate ourselves from those really deep and profound human connections that I think can sustain us and can help us grow. And so, I interviewed a guy named Mel Duncan, and Mel Duncan runs an organization called Nonviolent Peace Force, and they take well-trained and unarmed individuals and insert them into places of violent conflict around the world. Because even in places of violent conflict, there are people who are working towards resolution. There are peace activists who are trying to do good. But in Mel's words, they don't tend to live very long. Both sides want them out of the way. And Nonviolent Peace Force has figured out that if you put international observers on the ground side by side with them to accompany them on their journey, they tend to live longer. Because both sides of the conflict, if they see international players involved in it, they're less likely to disappear or harm those folks. And so Mel talks about how in the work he does, you have to be willing to let your heart be broken again and again. But it is those cracks in your heart that allow in the light of compassion, and that's where we grow. And so I tend to embrace that notion and that willingness to allow my heart to be broken, because that's part of the process of seeing the beauty as well.
Well said. Well, tell us more about the book. What can people expect inside the cover, and what do you hope the book accomplishes, or what do you hope people take away from engaging with it?
Yeah. Man, Matt, if I ever happen to say to you that I'm thinking of producing a 304-page hardcover book, please hit me upside the head and tell me to reconsider.
Dude, tell me about it.
It was a lot of work. But it is a 304-page journal of our 2.5 years on the road, which is to say, I think it's got 500, maybe almost 600 photos in the pages. It's got a lot of text, and some of this is the stories of the people we encountered. A portrait of them and part of their interview, an excerpt of their interview from the podcast that I did with them. And some of it is my own personal reflection about what I learned along the way, about some of the uncertainties of travel, about some of the of being semi-nomadic, about some of the beautiful landscapes that we encountered to help sustain us as we were doing some of this challenging work. And so it's a journal. Every 2 pages is a whole different story of people we encountered or experiences that we had. And it has started to do well. It won Minnesota Book Awards for the best general nonfiction last year. It won the Budapest Photo Awards for, gold medal for books. It won Peacemaker of the Year publication for IPI, which is independent press. So it's gotten some attention, but I think more than anything, it wound up saying what I wanted to say in the way I wanted to say it. I mean, in a way, if you've done a book, you know this, it's a little bit of personal therapy. It is a way for me to process and articulate what it is I've encountered on the road. And honestly, when we were on the road, things were happening so quickly that I didn't necessarily have the headspace to process it. And so when we came home, I sort of committed to a year to get this all out on paper and to turn it into a book. And that is what helped me sort of wrap my head around this big thing that we had just experienced.
That's awesome. That's super similar to what happened to me with my Colorado Trail experience. Like, I intentionally gave myself different concepts to think about every day. And then at the end of every day, I would record a video, and then I would journal. And I use the content of those to kind of as a framework for this book I'm working on.
Yep.
But to your point, until I started actually trying to get it onto paper, I had all of this stuff floating around in my head, and it was banging around like a bunch of pinballs hitting each other, and you're just like, I just need to get this out of my head, you know?
Yeah, that process of having to articulate it and having to write it down in a coherent fashion really is a part of refining my thought process. I feel like it has good, solid information as well as heart and soul. And to me, that's a pretty good combination.
Yeah. So one of the things I really want to ask you about relating to the process and the project that you're working on, I'd be super curious to hear your thoughts on how your worldview and or kind of your philosophies on life have shifted over time through the process of doing this work, if at all.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, quite a bit. I do imagine that my children wish I would have started this process sooner because I think it has made me a more patient person. It has made me a little less apt to jump to conclusions, a little less likely to dismiss people, a little more willing to ask questions, not to challenge, but to clarify. If I'm in a debate, instead of saying, yeah, but what about this? This was ridiculous, to say, whoa, help me understand that a little bit. How did you come to that conclusion? Those are two really different approaches to a debate. And I find that the first one is not productive. It doesn't get us anywhere. It creates barriers and it puts up walls between people. And I'm always curious about the processes that can disarm and break down those walls and open the possibility for more communication. And so certainly the people who I've interviewed, they come from different backgrounds. Some of them voted differently than me. Some of them believe differently than I do about fundamental core value things. But I don't need to come at them hard for that. It's perfectly fine for me to say, boy, that's not quite the way I see that issue.
Right.
But help me understand what led you. What are your experiences and what are the things that you're thinking about that get you there? And we can question in a way that helps people feel like they're being respected. We can question in a way that helps people feel like you've got a legitimate and compassionate curiosity. And I find that opens conversations way better than sort of the confrontational attitude that seems to be predominant in our current society.
Yeah, for sure. And some people might think I'm taking a little bit of a leap here, but I think what I'm about to say has some merit to it. So everything you just described to me is more of like a mindset and kind of like a philosophy of engagement with humanity. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how that mindset and philosophy has transformed and or augmented your approach to photography. Like, for example, what I found in myself is that the more I embrace some of those types of mindsets, when I'm out making images, it changes the way I think about capturing photographs and my approach to capturing images and my openness to exploring different creative ideas or techniques. And so I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on what that's looked like for you.
I want to preface this by saying nobody should ever have to watch me dance. It's not a pretty thing, but I think that I have learned that a lot of this process and a lot of this approach is a little bit like a dance. That I can't come in and just choose on my own how this thing is going to go. But it needs to be in relationship with somebody else. And that's a little bit of a dance. Like you got to feel that out. And, oh, what happens if I move this way? Then they move that way. And you can find a way to find that rhythm and you can find a way to find that poetry together that for me, I have a hard time describing as anything but a dance. And so I think working on this project has taught me how to be more relational with people, not just working in this project, but also, not just the people who I encounter for the project, but the people who I encounter for life. How can we figure out a way to do this together? I don't have to win. You don't have to win. We can find a way to sort of have a little bit of fun and beauty and whimsy with it. And I think, again, that includes letting go of some ego and embracing a little bit of humility. It involves being nimble and saying, oh, I don't think this thing is working. Maybe I have to retool and try this other thing. And so that's that's sort of constant movement and constant chaos, but I also think it's part of the world that we live in. And so we figure out a way that both people can win. We figure out a way to sort of thread the needle. When we feel that tension building up, well, maybe there's a way we can step aside and come at it from a different direction that lets us access that thing a little bit more effectively. And if the goal is to dominate and subvert and quote unquote win, well, then you're going to try one set of skills to achieve that end. But if the goal is to respect people, to find a way that people feel seen and heard, well, then it's a different approach. And so I guess we have to ask ourselves, what's the goal? Whenever we enter into any of those situations.
Yeah, it's funny because as you were talking, I'm seeing a lot of these parallels with photography, like especially landscape. So many people go out with like these preconceived ideas and like, oh, if there's not clouds, then I'm not even gonna get my camera out. And to me, it's like you were talking, like if you go with more of an open mindset and you have flexibility and you're not trying to impose your will on the situation and you're more having a conversation or a dance, as you described it, with the landscape, what I found is that you're going to discover things about yourself and about your subjects that is a little bit more relational and powerful and personal, which then is going to translate into you making photographs that are also personal and more interesting than what potentially you had kind of preconceived. So I think like that process of relating with humans can also be used in how you approach photographic subjects as well.
Yeah. And you know perfectly well, Matt, sometimes it's not a big shift, right? Sometimes you're looking at the scene and you're going, it's not quite right. And then you bend down because you dropped your lens cap and you look at it from 12 inches lower and you go, oh my God, there it is. So sometimes it's just that tiny shift, and that can be just retooling and using a different word when you're in conversation with somebody. Or for me, if I'm about to enter into a really difficult question, to frame it in a way that diffuses it a little bit and to say, hey, I don't know if I'm thinking about this right, but I'm really curious. So be patient with me. I don't even know if I'm going to ask it right, but be patient with me and see if we can figure this out. That sets the expectation and the tone so that I can enter a really hard conversation without somebody feeling they've been hit upside the head with it. You know? And so I think there's a lot of parallels.
Yeah. 100%. So relating to that concept, I'd be curious if you had any moments that were surprising encounters on the road where things maybe didn't go as planned and it led to something powerful.
Almost every day, it seems. I'll give you this example. We were in Mississippi. We were in a town called Columbus, Mississippi, and I was there to do interviews. Columbus was one of the first towns in Mississippi to decide to remove their Confederate monument from outside of their courthouse and move it over to a cemetery that had a plot of Confederate soldiers who were buried there. Just keep it up so you can talk about history and heritage, but maybe not in front of the halls of justice for the county, was sort of the mindset. Man, I had been doing a bunch of interviews and had a lot of catch-up work to do. I had to download photos, I had to edit some stuff, I had to edit some text, and really all I wanted was a day off to get caught up on some of this stuff. We were in our trailer camping down by the river, but I went into a coffee shop to get a latte, which is my treat of choice. And the guy in front of me, we just struck up a conversation. His name was Neil, and I said, Neil, what do you do? What's your thing? And he goes, I'm just paddling my canoe 6,500 miles across America to remember what's beautiful about this place again.
No big deal.
No big deal. I'm like, okay, I'm really not going to get a day off after all, am I? So it was that chance encounter and that willingness to say yes on my part and on his part. To say, okay, now let me tell you what I'm doing. Is this interesting to you? Should we sit down? Do you have time this afternoon to sit down and have a longer conversation about this? And it turned into this really beautiful interview. And so very often, like I said, we'll come into a community and try to have a lot of that stuff lined up. But I have learned that serendipity is sometimes a better planner than I am. I was working down in the Gulf of Mexico with some indigenous communities around land loss, environmental degradation and saltwater intrusion and all of these things. And I had a connection who said, yeah, come on over. Look forward to seeing you. I can connect you to a bunch of people. And then sort of went radio silent on me. And I sent a bunch of messages. The last one, which said, look, I'm about to drive 1,200 miles to come spend 3 weeks in your backyard. I hope that actually something's going to happen. In South Louisiana, I think sometimes the clock and the calendar works different than it works in Minnesota, which is fine, but I had to trust that process, right? And so I just showed up, and 2 days later, I got a text that said, hey, come on over, we can talk. And it turned into this really great series of interviews, but I had to resist my type sort of Germanic heritage planning syndrome that I deal with, and believe that things were going to be okay, and believe that it was worth going there. And it turns out it was, but there was a little anxiety in it too. So you have to learn how to navigate that, I guess.
That's right. You have to learn how to find comfort in the uncomfortable spaces.
Yeah, and learn what my weak points are, and tell the voice in my head to shut up.
Yeah. I have to do that all the time when I travel. Like when I'm home, I'm like super, super laid back, zero anxiety. But when I travel, there's like all these, lizard brain stuff that gets flipped on, and like I'll misplace my wallet. I mean, I've never ever in my entire life lost a wallet, not once. But literally every time I travel, I'm like, oh, where'd my wallet go? Like, I just start having these moments because, it's like if you lose your wallet, you're kind of screwed.
Yeah. Well, and I think we don't have to beat ourselves up for feeling that and experiencing that, but I do think we have to acknowledge it and pay attention to it and then decide what to do with it.
Yeah.
A lot of times I'll walk into a situation and I feel unsure or uncertain or self-doubt or whatever it is. I have trusted the process long enough and understood that there is reward at the end of that often enough that now I think I have the history that I can tell myself, you know what, it's going to be okay. Keep going.
Right.
Trust the process. You're going to be okay. But maybe that's one of the things about becoming an old person is that you've got that history in the background that says, okay, last time I allowed myself to enter into something that felt uncomfortable, it turned out okay. And then the next time, that turned out okay too. So I think I'm seeing a trend here. And that maybe makes me more willing to encounter it the next time.
Yeah, 100%. All right. So one of my last questions for you. So for people who are listening and they feel compelled to start their own storytelling or documentary project, especially around tough subjects, what advice would you give to those listeners?
Get ready. No, it's, I think I would say, and I would say this about working on any big project or pursuing any big life goal. Don't wait until you think you have it all figured out. If you wait until conditions are perfect and you have the whole path plotted and you know how everything is going to unfold, I think you will find yourself paralyzed and you'll never start. But if you just start moving, if you just begin the process, you'll start to learn, you'll start to understand, and you can change course and navigate and direct a little bit better. But how's the saying go? It's easier to navigate a moving boat. If you're sitting in a little boat on the water and it's not moving, you can move that rudder around all you want and it's not really going to redirect the boat. But if you start on a path and then you turn your rudder, it's going to move. It's going to respond. And I think for me, the most important thing is just to move, to just start. My methodology is to move forward, hit my head against the wall, back up, retool, reconsider, shift course a little bit, and try again until I run into a wall. I'm pretty stubborn that way, and I just think people get stuck in the planning process and should just be willing to do and see where it leads you.
I love that. I mean, maybe the best analogy is like riding a mountain bike. Like if you've ever tried to navigate difficult terrain on a bicycle and you're going really slow or you're stopped, like the bike is going to fall over. Like you're not going to go anywhere. But if you have enough speed, like you can get through really, really much easier. But if you go too fast, you might crash and kill yourself. So like,
yeah,
there's a balance there, right?
There is a balance, and that balance is a little different for everybody. At what speed can you travel? At what is your ability to navigate the terrain? But then I think that brings up another important point. When you're dealing with difficult subjects, my friend likes to say we do best what we do most, which is to say if you're having a conversation about race for the very first time in your life, you're probably not going to do it perfect. You might even make a couple of unfortunate missteps. And when that happens, we tend to retreat from it. But if we come back and try it again, if we learn, if we do some self-reflection, we come back and do it again, we might get better. You do it 100 times, you might get pretty good at it. You do it 1,000 times, you might be some sort of expert at it. But we have to exercise those muscles. We have to practice those skills because none of us is born with them. And if we run away from the practice, they're not going to get better.
100%. I mean, that translates to photography too. One of the most frustrating things I have is a lot of times people will come on a workshop and it's like, when did you last take a picture? Like, oh, my last workshop, which was a year ago. It's like, so basically I'm going to have to teach you everything again because you haven't done anything to like stay on top of that muscle memory or to practice. And like, it's anything in life. You have to do it often enough in order for it to become more ingrained into like who you are as a person. So I always encourage people, like, even if you're just taking a walk around the neighborhood, like, and you want to get better at photography and you don't feel confident yet, bring your camera and, make a lot of bad photos because eventually you're going to make better bad photos and eventually you're going to make okay photos and so on and so forth. So practice is incredibly important in any craft.
Yeah, law of averages. You just got to do it. Get the bad stuff out of your system and learn the tools and the skills that'll get you better. You want to be a writer, you better write.
Yep, exactly. All right, last question. Who do you recommend for the podcast? Who is someone we need to know more about?
Yeah, I've got a good friend I think you would enjoy talking to. His name is Steve Wewerka, Wewerka. He's an amazing photographer. We used to both sort of work in the commercial and editorial world, but he's moved towards landscape photography. He's got a beautiful eye. He's got a great vision. He also, likes to use his photography as a contemplative approach to life. And so he's got a lot to say with words in addition to his photography. So I'd encourage you to check out his work and reach out to him for a conversation. I've never been disappointed.
I love it. Well, John, this has been tremendous.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed this. Thanks for taking the time, Matt.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks again to John for joining me for such a thoughtful and timely conversation. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out the bonus episode available on Patreon. In that episode, John and I dive deeper into the role of creativity as a bridge for navigating political division and building empathy across differences. It's a powerful follow-up that adds even more context to the themes that we explored in this episode. You can support the podcast and gain access to bonus content like that for just $5 per month. And if you'd like early access to the episodes, bump up to the $10 a month tier. I'm working hard to keep this podcast as ad-free as possible, but that's only sustainable if listeners like you pitch in through Patreon. So if the show brings you value each week, please consider giving value back. Head over to patreon.com/fstop and listen, or click on the link in the show notes. Thanks for stopping in, collaborating with us, and listening. See you next week.